Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of FinServ Tech Oracles. Jerry and I have just been talking about how difficult it is to teach someone to whistle. How many different ways can you whistle, Jerry?
About four or five. And the interesting thing is, I had my grandson was asking me that the other day, and it's one thing to be able to whistle. It's another thing entirely to try to describe to somebody who can't how to do it. I find it very difficult.
So, if any of you actually have some good recommendations, please let us know because we've
Yeah.
been puzzling over this. But for this episode, we're not going to talk about whistling. Jerry, you wanted to talk about how many IT vendors can really be strategic vendors for a financial services firm. Seriously, how many?
Well, I think three tops, probably two. I'd start with one. What I've tended to find with people is it's one extreme or the other. It's either nobody is strategic and everybody is somebody that I'm just trying to rake over the coals for price, or everybody's strategic because everything's strategic. And it can't be that. You really have to have one or two, and that can really be partners with you to understand your business, that you can really align with. It's practically impossible to do that with more than a couple people.
Oh, which makes a lot of sense. What makes a vendor strategic? I know I have an answer to that, but I'm curious to what yours is.
Yeah, well, I think, this isn't the direct answer, but it can't be all about price. It's got to be primarily about business alignment. Somebody that has the same values as your company, somebody who's both important elements to your business, and yet they're not things that have your own expertise that you can do. So there are those two things, and there's somebody that whatever they're doing, their methods and practices and standards really align with your entire ecosystem. Your ethic, your planning, and that's a tough thing to get from somebody, I think.
Well, and that's a great perspective on what the vendor needs to have. The answer that I always like to give is many, many years ago, I asked an IT person at a very large enterprise, do you have any strategic vendors? And they said, yes, Oracle is our strategic vendor. So then I said, what do you mean by a strategic vendor? And here's what they said. Well, if we want something, we go and ask if Oracle has it. If they have it, we buy it and we're done. If they don't have it, we ask if they're planning to have it anytime soon. Is it on their strategic plan? If it's going to be available in a year or two, we wait, we buy it from them, and we're done. We ask them if it's not on their strategic plan, we ask them if they've got anything sort of close to it that might work. And if they do, we buy that, configure it, and we're done. Only if they don't have it, aren't planning to have it, and don't have anything close to it do we start looking outside the relationship, which I thought was a very interesting perspective. What do you think, Jerry?
Well, I think as you were describing that, I thought it's describing your behavior with a strategic vendor.
Correct.
It's not really telling me why they're a strategic vendor.
Yes, you gave us the why, and I'm giving you the other half, which is you gave us the vendor perspective, and I'm giving you the how you treat a strategic vendor. I'm not sure, by the way, that's the right way to treat it. But let's move on to the other vendors. What should the focus be with the rest of the other vendors?
Well, I think it's two things. It's basically cost containment and compatibility. I mean, you have strategic vendors for that one key reason, and everybody else, it's really got to be about how can I minimize my costs and work efficiently as possible. And that's what, in my opinion, that's what you really want to do with the rest of these vendors. And I would add to that compatibility, right? I mean, you want to have vendors that are going to fit into your ecosystem. You want to make sure that to the extent possible, you have a broad architecture, and any other vendors that you're partnering with, while they may not be strategic, they certainly should have interfaces that align with those things. They should have standards that are the same as your architectural standards to the extent possible.
Okay, great. Yeah, that ecosystem thing is interesting because several years ago we did a study and we asked folks what their procurement strategies were, and we gave them the choice of Big Rock, they buy from strategic vendors only. Feature functionality, they don't care about strategy, they just look for capability, price. Does it do what I need it to do at a price I'm willing to pay? We looked at ad hoc, which was just like, I don't really have a strategy. I just buy stuff when I decide to buy it. And then we looked at the ecosystem model, and we found that purchasing according to an ecosystem, regardless of whether or not they had strategic vendors, had the highest correlation with success by objective metrics. So I'm glad you brought up that ecosystem issue, because it turns out to be super important. Because when you talk about price, there's not just the cost of the hardware or the service, there's also the cost of doing the integration with everything else in your environment. And to the degree that that's already been done for you by the vendor, that reduces cost.
And something that people talk about as an after the fact, they don't really think about it. And here is where you need to think about it, is the term technical debt, right?
Yes.
The fact that you have something that aligns with the ecosystem, is compatible, it minimizes that technical debt, right? Now, if you have a strategic vendor, they're hopefully completely aligned with what your standards and visions and things like that are. Everybody else, if it's a cost saving measure, it's not just the price, it's the alignment and technical debt, and that's one of the things that you get with adhering to an ecosystem, is the minimization of that. But when it creeps in is when people are focused on functionality over those things, and then ultimately that ends up biting you further down the road, because now all of a sudden you've got something either thrown away or doesn't tie into things, and now that's when you start making these kludgy artifacts that try to interface and compete, or you're double entering, and that's where all your problems happen.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up technical debt, because the place to think about technical debt is before you buy the product.
Yes.
How much technical debt am I going to have from this product is the way to think about it. Well, that pretty much wraps up with our topic at the moment. Jerry, what are your recommendations?
Well, my recommendations are, you should have a strategic vendor. If you don't, you may have a problem. So first is, do have a strategic vendor. Second is, work with them as a partner. Make sure you do have understand what your architecture and ecosystem are, and then once they're aligned with that, any of the other vendors that you have that are not strategic, make sure that you have that as a criteria for what else you're bringing into the party.
Excellent. And with that, that's a wrap of FinServ Tech Oracles. Please subscribe to the entire series. You can just go ahead and click on the link and subscribe to the entire series. We come on Tuesdays at 9 o'clock before the markets open. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Happy holiday.